Sorry,
Uh,
sorry, I will do it again.
okay, no
Uh,
worries. Um, I'll do the introduction, you do the slides. Awesome, thank you.
okay, perfect.
Cool. It's my pleasure to introduce Jianghao Liu. Jianghao has a background in medical engineering, and he traded in machines for brains for his PhD, which he did in cognitive neuroscience together with Paolo Bartolomeo in Paris using high field fMRI to study visual mental imagery and consciousness. And I had the pleasure of meeting Jianghao for the first time during his PhD defense, and I was really impressed by the breadth and the strong analytical quality of his work. And his research has already shed important new light on the mechanisms of aphantasia, the absence of conscious imagery. After his PhD, Jianghao co-founded an interdisciplinary reading club on aphantasia to advance interdisciplinary studies of aphantasia, and he hosts monthly online speakers at his club. He currently works both at the ICM and at Neurospin, together with Paolo Bartolomeo and Stanislas de Hane, and he is also working as a research engineer at Dassault Systems. Today, Jianghao will tell us about his newest work on a neural model of conscious imagery and aphantasia. Jianghao, take it away.
Thank you very much. So let me do it in can you see it? Perfect. Okay, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here, and actually, this is my first time to talk really something about consciousness and mental imagery together. So I have been working on interaction between attention and consciousness for years, and then mental imagery, and then aphantasia. So I've always been thinking, what's the link between them? It seems in both domains, there is no clear discussion on both things together, especially also for the philosophers when they're talking about mental imagery. It's hardly they're talking about consciousness, but in the mental imagery field, people just talking about the visual cortex and hardly talking what could be the mechanism behind for this kind of a subject experience. So today, I will try to introduce a new model to put these things together, and the motivation is not really do something conclusive, but trying to provide a starting point to build a new avenue to put new research possible in the future. So all the evidence I want to include in this talk definitely is not exclusively complete. So it's just something to inspire for new discussions and ever. So when we talk about mental imagery, so probably I want to imagine sunny sand beach. Like last holidays, you are during the summer holidays. Where were you doing in a beach? So most people will imagine something like this in their mind. So you visualize the sunny scenarios with a lot of waves and sand and people around the scenarios. But the vividness, people will say, is more or less clear not. So until some people say, okay, I don't really visualize anything. And in this case, we define it as aphantasia. So people voluntarily generate no mental images. They don't really see anything in their mind side. But is it the real case that they don't see anything and don't imagine anything? Actually, it's not. So if you want them to describe about their imagination, about the same scenario, they will say, I do have a lot of concepts, and I do arrange this concept by accurate locations of this concept in my mental images, even though this mental images is not perceptual, is not picture, but I do have mental images of concept. So well, this actually tell us when we talk with any people with mental with aphantasia, actually we could not really assume that they have some empty thought in their mind. They do have very vivid and rich concepts. Let's skip to this. Actually, around 2 to 5% of general population report of no voluntary mental imagery. But if you ask them whether they have dreams or of hallucinations, actually half of them, or at least half of them, do have this kind of involuntary experience. And very surprisingly, so if you want to test them with a very traditional mental imagery task like mental rotation or visual or verbal working memory task, so in almost all these kind of neuropsychological tests, they have no problems at all. So the only difference probably they have a slower response in some very hard items. So however, they have like more consistent deficit in recalling some kind of events related to their self, so like also biographic memory. So if you want them to recall some specific date, so what was happening in their last or few years ago about their anniversary, they could really hardly record what kind of the details in it. But in contrast, if you want them to remember some objective dates like happening for the history, actually they could recall a lot of detail on it. So it seems their deficit of memory is really related to their self. They really use some kind of alternative strategies and visualization to memory things. So for example, if you want them to describe a cat, a black cat here, so at least for myself, I visualize it very vividly, and I also have 2 cats in my home. But aphantasics, they just describe fully verbally with just 1 sentence, and sometimes they could describe the parts of cat bodies and arrange them in very specific semantic ways. And also they rely on other sense of sensory modalities to encode and then retrieve the information. It's important that like half of the aphantasias, they are total aphantasias. They don't have mental imagery in any kind of sensory modality. But some aphantasia do exist just in specific modality. Like they are only visual aphantasia, and they do hear some inner voice. So it's very interesting to see this kind of aphantasia phenomena in the research of subjective experience. So in this talk, I'll just briefly describe over 70 fMRI in both imagery, typical images and aphantasia, and then I try to discuss it in a new model of conscious mental imagery, and then last, I will try to elaborate a few kind of ongoing research on how to use this kind of model to inspire new researchers. Regarding mental imagery, there was a very famous case. Actually, it was the first time to describe the loss of mental imagery in the history. Actually, it was happened in Paris, in Salpêtrière Hospital, where I was working on. In this case, Charcot and Bernard, they described a case that a patient lost mental imagery just overnight. But we didn't know at this era what was the cause of the mental injury, whether it's neurological or psychological. But this was the first case that recorded the loss of mental imagery, probably due to some brain damage. And along many years of research, more and more studies on neurological patients with brain lesions, they found the people or the patients who report loss of mental imagery typically have this lesion in the posterior of the brain, especially in the left hemisphere. And this could be something informative for us to localize what could be the neurosubstrate of the mental imagery. And also, some people lost mental imagery, they not only just report total loss of mental imagery. So some people do report some specific mental imagery loss in faces, colors, words. So actually depends on the lesion locations. This could be dissociable in the visual cortex in the posterior area for different categories. As we know, a lot of in the past decades, a lot of research work on mental imagery focus on the early visual cortex. It seems very controversy between the neuroimaging study the last decades with the patient study because if you find a patient with bilateral lesion in the V1, normally from the theories that predict V1 importance for mental imagery, with these patients who are blind, they could also lose mental imagery as well. But very striking evidence suggests they do have vivid mental imagery, even just blind and don't have a bilateral visual cortex in the primary visual area. So let's have a recap of the current models of the mental imagery. Largely, I think, developed by Koslin and colleagues, and recently by Nadine. So the very prominent models proposed this imagery generation as the vision in reverse. So the prefrontal cortex retrieved the action of the or intention of the imagery and then retrieve the semantic and the episodic information from the medial temporal lobe, like hippocampus or anterior temporal lobe, and then project all this information in the visual cortex. So it's related to reactivation of the sensory cortex, especially the primary visual cortex. So the vividness could be correlated with the bot signal and even the structure, volume, or functions of the primary visual cortex. There are even more striking way, like more controlled way to study the primary visual cortex and suggesting the retinotopic structure organization of the primary visual cortex do related to the imagery content. But it's still controversial what is exactly rule of the primary visual cortex regarding to the findings from the neurological patients. On the other hand, from the patient studies, actually they emphasize the role of the high-level visual cortex separated by different categories. And also a specific point in the left hemisphere could impact imagery or in all different domains. So probably it suggests this kind of lesion study suggests a separation of domain general and domain periphery mechanism within the high-level visual cortex. So in the first stage in our study, we really wanted to know, is this kind of mechanism in the high-level visual cortex is true and could be probate in the neuroimaging in typical imagery, and how does it reflect also or related to the vividness of imagery, especially its absence in aphantasia. So really to disentangle different domains, we first ask participants to imagine different content of domains. So here, actually this I directly inspired the task of Koslin's experiment. Ask participants to imagine the shape of objects. And then, for example, imagine beaver and fox, which one have a longer body shape. So I think most of you will respond the fox, right? Just imagine two cute beaver and fox. We also studied other kind of domains like colors. So we want them to compare the overall appearance of fruits, of vegetables, spinach, lettuce, which one have a darker appearance. And imagine the written form of words. So within 4 lines, like you're really writing it, but without your hand, just with your men's side. Espoir, amitié, French words. Which one contains descendant or ascendant? And then the face of famous people. So here, 2 French presidents, Emmanuel Macron and François Hollande. Which one have an elongated face or a round face? And the last one regarding to the spatial relationship between different French cities projected on a French map. So we asked them to do all these tasks, and we also included 2 other groups, like a very vivid imagery and people with typical aphantasia. they did the task by imagining all these stimuli by listening to auditory words, and then look at the same stimuli in perception. So I think there were a lot of discussion about whether this kind of task really probe mental imagery. So here I want to stress we are looking at different categories, and at least in the typical imagers, we do find this reversed correlation between the imagery response time and the vividness. So I think at least in this kind of typical imagers, and also the report, they really use the imagery to respond to this task. And I think this task in these typical imagers, they could include both the semantic retriever and then based on the semantics to build their mental imagery to respond to this task. So in aphantasia, very surprisingly, these tasks are actually not very sensitive to identify them because they have almost a ceiling effect in the imagery accuracy, even though they don't really imagine the pictures. But they have some kind of reduced response time regarding to the typical imager and vivid imagers. So if aphantasia, so congenital aphantasia could respond to this question, is this a sign to interpret that their condition, like absence of visual consciousness, that they do have the visual, cognitive access to this visual content, or is it just like a deficit of metacognition? So to further probe this, we look at the neural activity. We ask them to do the same task in the fMRI, and we scanned in 70. In this case, we added another condition, control condition like abstract words task. So participants had to thinking about the meaning of two words, routine, convention, and which one have a closer meaning with the society. So actually this task evoked very limited mental imagery. So we could use the contrast with imagery trials, with these trials to identify the imagery networks. So we did this contrast, use all imagery versus abstract words. We do find a very prominent pattern, firstly in the frontoparietal cortex, but also this pattern almost in the left hemisphere, especially these infrafrontal gyrus and interparietal circles. I think this was recurrently funded also in a previous study, also by 19, I think. So actually the prefrontal cortex and the parietal cortex do implicated in the generation of the mental imagery, and not only the visual cortex alone. So very interesting here, we found a node also in the left hemisphere in the occipital temporal circles. So actually, we called it a fusiform imagery node, as we previously reported in the meta-analysis. So actually, this confirms this domain general activity. So for all the imagery content do present in this left hemisphere fusiform imagery node. And then we look at the functional profiles of the fusiform imagery node, the FIN. Actually, there's no difference at all in the typical imagers and aphantasia, because initially we thought, okay, look at the patients with the lesion, they have damage in this area, they lost mental imagery. So probably congenital aphantasia, they don't have mental imagery. Could they have deficit in this node regarding to the activity? The result shows no, they are intact. And then we look at domain preferring regions. So due to the high resolution in the 70, we could isolate the high-level visual cortex like fusiform face area, visual word form area, and a lot of other regions in single participant. And we checked in over 10 participants of aphantasia, all of them have high-level visual activity for specific domain. So even for each domain. So So their aphantasia could not really be directly linked to the activity in this high-level visual cortex. However, we did another analysis to look at V1. In V1, we specifically separated in fovea V1 and peripheral V1. So actually, the activity is very different because for peripheral V1, the activity was both positive for perception and imagery. But in the fovea V1, the activity was only activated for perception, but inhibited in imagery. So there are some kind of a discussion about what's the rule of the V1. I think this is very consistent with recently proposed also by Nadine and by Pearson. The V1 could also contribute in inhibitory rule, not always active for the imagery. So in aphantasia, we found even enhanced inhibition in the fovea V1. The real striking evidence and related to the vividness of the imagery came from the representation pattern. So actually, during both imagery and perception, in the high-level visual cortex and in the V1, especially in aphantasia, they have striking content-specific pattern decodable in both imagery and perception. That means they are trying to imagine something. Their imaging activity is content-specific. But the striking difference is if you look at the correlation, because participants were imagining and perceived of same stimuli. So if you look at the representation matrix in both imagery and perception and do the correlation between them, the correlation was only significant in typical imagery and was not above 0 in aphantasia, especially in typical imagery. This kind of representational overlap, the correlation between imagery and the perception, was correlated with reported vividness in this group. So this could be some kind of evidence suggest for absence of perceptual-like imagery in aphantasia. And then we look at the functional connectivity of the thing, the whole brain connectivity, and contrast it with between groups. A very striking point we found have reduced functional connectivity is this left anterior prefrontal cortex. So actually, this was the evidence previously reported related to metacognition and not related to the consciousness threshold in conscious perception experiment. But here we repeatedly found it in imagery experiment and reduced in aphantasia. And another evidence showed also aphantasia have this reduced functional connectivity with the left FEF. The left FEF was typically related to the orienting of attention, and they have this reduced functional connectivity in perception, probably suggests also their encoding process or memory process during the encoding could also be impacted by the attention. Is there anything really abnormal related to attention in aphantasia? So we did contrast to see whether aphantasia have something more, because this could be a sign to show probably they used some kind of other strategies to do the task. We do find some higher activity, and all this activity in the right hemisphere ventral attention network. Actually, at the first time I saw this result, I was very surprised. Why does aphantasia have something to do with attention? Typically in behavior, they didn't show anything, or in the life, they don't have anything like a visual neglect or something related to attention. But they do have this abnormal activity in attention during both imagery and perception tasks, because this ventral attention networks is kind of reorienting attention or inhibitory control during during the task, and normally they are not really active in active engaging of the imagery. And this task was functional connect. This network was functionally connected, actually back to the imagery generation network, like the left FEF, this semantic network, and also the fusiform invention, and even the V1. So it seems plausible interpretation, the hyperactivity of this ventral attention network could be voluntarily active to disrupt the ongoing generation of imagery in aphantasia. But this is the hypothesis need further improvement.
Jianghao, can I just quickly ask a clarification question? Did you find higher activation in the ventral attention network in aphantasia than compared to
Yes.
typical images? Yeah, okay, cool.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Yeah. This is very interesting and a little bit puzzle for me. So since we have a lot of categories and we have 70, we did a very specific analysis on looking at different patches. So from the monkey physiology, the high-level visual cortex is not just one face area or one word area or whatever. They have split it into different small patches, and we could identify them in the 70. So the overall result we found here, actually, again, in the anterior patch, there are some representational overlap only in typical imagery and absent in aphantasic participant. And they had this reduced the functional connectivity between the patches, sorry, between the anterior temporal lobe to the orbitofrontal cortex, or that direction. Actually, this is also in line with the previous study. So even though we only look at the domain specificity here, the two very consistent deficit in aphantasia. So one was the absence of the representational overlap between imagery and perception, suggesting they don't rely on the perceptual-like representation during the task. And the second one, this functional connectivity between the temporal lobe and the anterior area, like especially the prefrontal area, would be very prominent across different studies. And then the abnormal activity in the ventral attention network, and I don't know what exactly the rule. So based on this evidence, we proposed that aphantasia could be kind of a functional disconnection, especially the interaction between different frontal parietal network for imagery and for attention could have reduced the feedback to the ventral visual area and even in the primary visual cortex during the imagery. So based on this evidence, I think a lot of other evidence also, like Kadai and other colleagues, people suggest that whether aphantasia have unconscious mental imagery. So firstly, elicited by philosopher Vincent Nane, and then the VAC propagated to the imagery research, and especially in the mental imagery and aphantasia. So if we really disentangle these definitions, I think the difference is really so all the center of the debate on these kind of things actually is on two things. The first one, do they have unconscious visual representation? I think probably yes. At least our result shows this very consistent high-level visual cortex, and the other studies show the consistent early visual cortex content. But the definition, we have to really question it at the moment here. So mental imagery is defined like perceptual process or representation that is not elicited directly by sensory input. So if you want to really define unconscious mental imagery, so actually probably it's also a perceptual, so at the first stage is a perceptual process associated with imagery. Is this really the case? So we provide three criteria. So first, whether the activity in aphantasia was observable in the visual cortex, and then whether it's contains stimulus information, and then whether this stimulus information is shared with perceptual or is perceptual-like. So at least aphantasia correspond to the first two criterion, but not the last one. So they don't have this perceptual like content in the visual cortex. So we propose that aphantasics have unconscious visual representation rather than unconscious imagery. So due to the absence of perceptual-like format. So this is the conclusion that we could draw at this stage. But probably you know, aphantasia includes a lot of heterogeneity. So actually, we could not really exclude any aphantasia do include perceptual-like representation. So in this case, to further discuss the possibility of the unconscious imagery, I think we really need a theory and not just look at the definition itself here. So I think it's a very interesting case in the last century at the beginning of the discussion about consciousness, whether V1 was included or whether the activity of the V1 was related to the conscious perception. I just borrowed the same title from the famous article by Christoph Gok and Frisch. Are we aware of the neural activity in imagination? So if we go step back to the model of mental imagery, a very prominent view, actually it's assumed the reactivation of the visual cortex in imagery generation actually is sufficient for imagery experience because it's the last step in the imagery generation and your subject experience arrives, especially you have this visual buffer, the primary visual cortex, reactivate it and encode visual information. But from the case, especially the aphantasia, even successful reactivation of sensory cortex in imagery is not sufficient to have the experience of the imagery. And it's not only for the aphantasia, but also other abundant of evidence also showed that kind of spontaneous activity also occur in an unconscious way in the visual cortex, in both the high-level visual cortex and the V1. So it's a really question for us. What are the additional, but probably yet undefined process required for a conscious experience of the imagery? Since we don't have a clear idea on it, so let's first look at the conscious perception, which is widely developed by previous theories like global neural network space and high order representation theories, and even IIT and a lot of other things. So here, I'm not really doing an exclusive interpretation of all these theories, but from our experiment, we do see this reduced functional connectivity between the visual areas and the higher level prefrontal cortex. So it seems it could support the for example, the global neural network space and also the high level order representation things. But there are specific interpretation. I think we could discuss this later. So let's first look at the global neural network space. Actually, the conscious experience for the external stimuli arise into different stages from subliminal and pre-conscious and then the conscious way. Especially going through this pre-conscious to conscious perception, the global neural space, I think there is a very important attention amplification by the top-down prefrontal feedback to the visual area, especially important for weak signal, to enhance the weak signal to go through threshold of access to consciousness. So this is the main idea, and go go to look at a broader literature, actually, I think there is a very consistent evidence suggest a shared conscious access to either perceptual and involuntary imagery signal through a threshold mechanism. So first, is there access to the conscious experience shared between external and internal signals? In the global neural network space, actually it accounts for different modules. So we are talking about modality, but it also accounts for like language, sensory, modality, and emotions. So it's kind of a general workspace for all kinds of stimuli, whether they are internally generated or externally elicited. And then the common reverberant or recurrent loop is very important to build the long-range functional connectivity to enhance the weak signal to go through the conscious threshold. So for either internal and external stimuli, especially they run a lot of like a computational modeling and simulation to prove this kind of spontaneous activity generated in the brain. They also realized kind of top-down attention amplification and a threshold mechanism. And the third one, in the domain of imagery, it shows a shared or at least a partially overlapping mechanism between the imagery and perception, both on the frontal parietal network and the high-level areas, well, and probably the early visual areas, but with a different roles. And recently, with a very, I think it's a fantastic work from Nadine, they showed this while participant was perceiving and imagining of the same stimuli, there is a shared threshold or even its implicit threshold in the detection of the signal originating from both external reality and internal imagination. So the specific mechanism could be related to monitoring of a reality signal implicated in the high-level visual cortex and in the anterior insular area. But at least this could be kind of evidence supporting, it could be kind of a threshold mechanism implicated in both imagery and perception. However, there is a very striking thing that is missing in the areas of imagery of internal representation, this kind of attention for the conscious visual experience. Because this kind of conscious visual experience mostly started widely in the conscious perception. So what's happening in the generation of internal stimuli? I think attention could at least have three kind of functions. So first one, so early attentional orienting or reorienting could provide a preparatory state. Even you start to imagine something, you have to reorient or orient your attention into the inner thought. And then attention have a role in feature bindings. So probably you have heard a case of synesthesia. For these people, they could just like looking at words and experience color on it. And this experience, we could probably say it kind of involuntary mental imagery is because it's almost automatic for them. But abundant line of research suggests that if you don't have the attention or if you don't have attention on the inducing stimuli, like the words, or your inducing stimuli is masked, you're not consciously perceive the inducing stimuli, you will not have automatically generate this involuntary imagery of experience on it. So it suggests that the feature bindings could also relate to the attention state on the internal, even though it's unconscious or involuntary imagery. And third one, attention amplification is critical for weak signal in both external and spontaneous activity, especially in the initial hypothesis by Stan Dan in 2006 paper. Attention is necessary for the weak signal. But for imagery, a lot of evidence suggests either for the subject experience and look at the visual cortex, the signal for imagery is even weaker than perception. So I think it's very reasonable to interpret the rule of attention could even be more important or prominent in perception, in imagery than in perception. So I think here it's an illustration what I really see the translation of the steps in conscious perception into conscious mental imagery. So from our experiment, after the imagery generation, the reactivate of the sensory cortex, so we think there are two additional steps. First is the integration of the visual features, binding or tuning the perceptual like representation within the local visual cortex. And this was absent in congenital aphantasia and correlated with the subject experience in typical imagery. And then there is amplification guided by the attention to amplify this weak imagery signal and propagate to the prefrontal cortex. So the establishment of the prefrontal cortex and the high-level visual cortex recurrency to feedback and then recurrent activity could be essential to establish a stable imagery experience. Just to compare to this. And also especially the amplification stage, I think is shared for the internal and external stimuli. They could be kind of a binary and a thresholded amplification stage in the visual cortex when the signal propagates to the prefrontal cortex. And even in the prefrontal cortex, I think I haven't mentioned it, in the orbital frontal cortex, the signal, even for different specific domains, their signal seems to be really binary. So they're only activated for the specific domain they are preferred, and even deactivated for their non-preferred domains. But in the high-level visual cortex, like fusiform areas, they just have preference for their categories, but they also activated for the non-preferred categories. I think this is very different between the function of the visual cortex and the prefrontal cortex. So in this model, largely based on our result observed in aphantasia, we think they're interacting. The interacting activity between the dorsal attention network and the ventral attention network could be very important to stabilize, probably by inhibitory and excitatory mechanism, doing this feedback to the high-level visual areas. And also both these attention networks and also even the default mode networks could be controlled or regulated by the Salins network, represented by the anterior insular cortex. And this has also been shown, for example, the anterior insula could have a rule to switch between internal and external attention to regulate the imagery and the perception for conscious access. In aphantasia, due to this probably altered interaction between the attention networks, they could have this reduced feedback to the high-level visual cortex and also in the early visual early areas related to this stage of integration perception, like representation or directly reduced amplification to elicit these visual signals, internally generated visual signals for conscious access in the prefrontal cortex. So the last part, I will just use a few minutes to go back to the case, which is very famously discussed in the imagery field. Please imagine a red apple. So picture an apple, red, right? So you can visualize the shape, color, and a lot of things. So based on the model that I have illustrated, I think there are different stages. You imagine an apple, you initiate firstly the semantic retrieval. So it's an apple, it's not a pear. And then you have some access to the conceptual knowledge. So an apple is a round, edible fruit with slightly waxing skin, even though you don't really see it, but you do have this semantic conceptual knowledge directly linked to the keywords like apple. And then you have this voluntary generation of imagery with the sensory reactivation and probably integration, which give you probably increasing report of details. Like a gala apple could relate to red, yellow streaks and a green leaf if you want. And then the amplification stage arise this sensory signal through this recurrent activity for the conscious experience. So through the dissociable stages of this unconscious or conscious imagery processing, I think it's a very good way to explain the observation in different kind of subtype of mental image, subtype of aphantasia. So like all code aphantasia, actually they could due to the failure, the sensory activation, because it's due to the lesion directly damage to the cortical area. And the congenital aphantasia, they do have this sensory reactivation, but they have reduced the top-down feedback in the integration or in the amplification. Actually, with this model, could we use this model to imagine something more, like create induced aphantasia? So like in studying the conscious perception, since we have a theory of consciousness, we could dissociate different stages, and then we could use like masking or continuous flash separation to destroy different stage and to observe whether we could create deficit of consciousness in typical participant. So here, I think if this is true, the conscious imagery do rely on these two stages. With some proper experiment, we could create induced aphantasia. Just to wrap up, so here, based on the experiment result, I just want to propose a attention model of conscious imagery. Actually, this is the starting point to really think about different stage of how unconscious imagery processing give rise to the subjective experience of imagery. And I argue they probably arise from three stages, from this generation, integration, and amplification process, and largely probably shared with the conscious perception. But I think there are also something different we could discuss later. Especially attention appears to be necessary, though not sufficient, for the conscious experience to arrive. Aphantasia is just impaired top-down modulation, but they do have unconscious visual processing. So I think the implication of this kind of model could inspire, firstly, the research in imagery. So imagery, if you ask philosophers, most of philosophers, I think so like Sartre, imagery should be a conscious process. Especially Sartre says consciousness, imagery is another form of consciousness, like intention directed to absence. So I'm not discussing philosophy here, but I do want to emphasize for most of people, and also for myself, for my subject's experience should be the imagery experience should be conscious. But here I want to argue if we specify different stage in imagery processing, probably some stages are just unconscious. The second one for the series of consciousness, they rest mostly on the conscious perception studies. So what happens in the internally generated signal? For the spontaneous signal, there are some studies, but for the voluntarily generated imagery, I don't really know or see any prominent theory or studies on it at the moment. But we also facing some critical questions. If we could mask visual stimulus in perception, but how could we create unconscious imagery? For myself, I don't think the masking could be really case because it's related to the external stimuli. But the question is how to create masked unconscious internal representation to study unconscious imagery. And of course, it elicited more questions. For example, how to distinguish signal from the subjective perception and imagery, because the evidence that I presented here, they largely relied on the shared representation or threshold mechanism between the two processes. But there are also other evidence suggest the visual cortex activity, like relying on different cortical layers or different stress of signal, and even different functional gradients, or even the dimensions of the representation could be different between the imagery and perception. So I'm not extending this evidence here, and especially also what's the rule of attention for the conscious experience. So I think I will stop here. Probably I will just use 2 minutes very fastly to introduce what we are doing to use this model to inspire a few researchers. So firstly, we do the direct electric stimulation on the cortex while participants trying, actually it's not participants, it's patients, while patients during the tumor removal during surgery, so they are awake. So the surgeons could stimulate different brain to map the language or emotion networks. So we asked them, could they do this for us to the imagery network? So we asked participants to imagine first one, strawberry. Do you visualize it? So they say yes. So they are not aphantasics. And then during the second item, so is the second item cherry darker or lighter than the first item? So in this stage, participant was asked to compare the two items at the same time, imagine it very vividly. However, at the start point of the second item, we stimulate some different brain area to disrupt the potential imagery process. And what we found? So we found in most of the cortical area, in the high level area and prefrontal cortex, they have a significant reduction of both the report of response, the report whether strawberry or cherry is darker, the accuracy, and also the vividness. So it seems this both to access to the report and the subject experience are related in the cortical areas. However, if you look at the evidence from stimulating the subcortical tracts, so you know there are a lot of white matter tracts connecting to long-range functional, to support long-range functional connectivity between the visual cortex and the prefrontal cortex. We do see a dissociation of the subjective vividness and access to the visual knowledge. So especially stimulates the inhibition of the anterior insula connected by the IFOF or the uncinate fasciculus in this area, they could destroy either the vividness or either the subject report. So it seems the mechanism or different stages could be dissociable in the subcortical areas. And we did second studies on congenital aphantasia to look at whether the functional disconnection between the frontal cortex and the visual area is reflected in microstructural anatomy. So we examined 48 main tracts in the brain, and we do observed 6 tracts showing group differences. But very interesting, the only difference showing the vividness correlation with the intensity of the tracks in typical imagery was the superior longitudinal fasciculus. But the SLF, these fasciculus have different branches. The first branches was negatively correlated with vividness, but the third branches was positively correlated with vividness. So I think it suggests again, probably there's something related to attention, even in the congenital aphantasia, that we have not been widely observed by the behavioral evidence. So it's interesting to investigate in depth what is the role of different mechanisms of attention in modulating conscious imagery. So the last one, for the aphantasia, they have congenital aphantasia, and patients with brain lesion develop aphantasia. But sometimes participants report aphantasia, loss of mental imagery after depression or after some kind of psychological conditions. So in most of these cases, it seems the loss of mental imagery was also related to the attention, so the altered attention to the internal interoceptic signals. So they have more problems in to be aware of the body signals in this kind of psychiatric conditions. So I think probably we could extend the current model into 2 different streams. The first one is the attention stream, and the second one is the ventral interoceptive processing, because different subtype of aphantasia could be related to different integration process in the brain and the amplification process. So I think I will stop here. I want to thank the 2 labs, in the Paris Brain Institute and in the Neurospin, and all the collaborators contributed to all this fantastic work. And we have a very small test. You can do it on your phone. It's kind of test of remember a sequence of dots. You can just do it on your phone. I think it's very, very challenging, but very surprisingly, I could give you first preliminary result. It's related to working memory of regularity of the points. Aphantasia have better accuracy to remember this kind of things. This is very counterintuitive for me. So we are trying to collect more evidence on it. If you have time, you can help us. Thank you very much.
All right, let's unmute everybody. Give Jianghao a round of applause. Thank you so much. That was excellent. Oh, yes. That was great.